Kia ora koutou. Welcome to the Happy Revolution, where we talk with academics, activists, pastors and public figures about their lives, their areas of expertise and what brings them hope. I'm Matthew Bartlett, a chaplain here at Te Herenga Waka.
And my name is Rayne. I am a student here at Vic as well. Today we're interviewing Dr. Luke Barnes. Luke is an astrophysicist at Western Sydney University and was visiting Victoria to give a lecture called Why Does the Universe Appear Fine-Tuned for Life? We thought we'd take the chance to interview him while he was in town.
Dr. Barnes is probably the world's leading expert on the apparent fine-tuning of the universe, and he works at this topic from both astronomical and philosophical angles. As well as exploring that topic, we get into a bit of his life story, including growing up in a young earth creationist church context.
We also chatted with Luke about lots of other things like what is the point of academic publishing and the problem of evil, as well as some of Luke's favourite books. Many thanks to all involved in the publishing of this podcast and to Luke for agreeing to chat with us in such short notice. We hope you enjoy the podcast.
Would you mind just telling us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, so I'm an astronomer and an astrophysicist at Western Sydney University. So I guess my official title is senior lecturer. As well as doing all of that teaching, my research is in a number of fields, including how galaxies form, how the universe expands. More recently, some of the more exciting bits that are like black holes that are doing some fun stuff. And particularly this topic of life and how it relates to the fundamental properties of the universe.
What got you into that particular topic? When I looked at your publication list, there was a lot about that sort of thing.
It sort of happened a little bit by accident. I was in the UK doing my PhD at Cambridge, and they invite you to do a talk to the public. And I'd sort of heard about all this fine-tuning stuff from books by Paul Davis and a bunch of other people as being something kind of interesting and slightly alarming to some people. And I thought, I'll do a talk about it, and that'll force me to read everything. And things sort of snowballed after that. I realised that no one had really properly summarised the scientific literature for a while. And so I started writing this. It started as a blog post that got out of hand and turned into a review article, which then turned into a colleague of mine who was a friend. He was my honour supervisor, Geraint Lewis, asking me to write a book with him about it, and realising that there's open opportunities to actually develop the field further and write papers on it. So that's how I ended up with this as one of my research focuses.
What is that focus?
So, the fine-tuning of the universe for life, the very short version is that things got a bit weird in the 70s. There are these numbers that, when you're a physicist, the thing you want your equations to do is to give you numbers, because those are predictions, and you can go and check whether you're right or wrong. So, you sort of, most of your job is to get numbers out of equations. But when we look at the deepest equations we have, called the Standard Model of Particle Physics, Standard Model of Cosmology, there's some numbers, there's a small set, well, seemingly fairly small, 25, 30-ish numbers that you have to put in. Once you put them in, the equations do great, but if you don't put them in, the equations don't know what to do. Things like how heavy is an electron, right? So a fundamental particle, how heavy is it? What's its mass? And how strong does this thing pull on that thing? And how fast is the universe accelerating? These sorts of things. A quote from Richard Feynman, who was one of the key figures of physics in the 20th century, Nobel Prize winner, who said, about one of these numbers, every physicist should put this up on their wall and worry about it. Because we don't know why they are what they are. And what was noticed 70s and especially into the 80s, and increasingly now as we look at it in more detail, is that if those numbers had been different, you don't just get like a slightly heavier this or a slightly faster expanding that. There are sort of these tipping points that where the universe goes from the complexity we see to suddenly being just ridiculously simple, in the form of, like, if you can stick particles together, you can make chemistry happen, all the complexities of reactions and all that. If they don't stick together anymore, all that's gone. So yeah, this is the fine-tuning of the universe for life, and it's a weird thing that is worth thinking hard about.
What are the leading explanations for why it is that way?
So there's a couple. One of them from Nobel Prize winner David Gross sort of quoted Churchill by saying, never, never, never give up. Basically, let's do some more physics until we know why those numbers had to be what they are and they couldn't have been anything else. So eventually we'll get to the point where we could write some equation where it's like, how heavy is an electron? Well, here's the answer in terms of pi and 2 and e, and all just numbers. It has to be that way. That's one option. It'd still be a bit weird that the abstract symmetry principles, whatever it is that gives that number, just sort of seems to like electrons that do interesting things, like humans. So that would be a bit weird. One of the other options is a multiverse. So sometimes if something seemingly unlikely happened, it's because there were lots of different chances. So we won the lottery. There's lots of other universes out there with lots of different values of the constants. And obviously no one's sitting around doing podcasts being like, why did we get the wrong values here? There's no one there. And yet it immediately got attention from... Actually, it got attention kind of slowly. It's interesting. But it eventually got attention from people who think that there is a mind behind the universe as being, hang on a minute, this all sounds very good for us. This sounds wonderful. In fact, there are similar sorts of arguments that are very old that just sort of went out of fashion slightly. William Paley and earlier just saying, well, if these numbers had been different, the universe would have turned out in a much simpler, much less conducive to life kind of way. But that would be they are what they are, because it's actually a quote from Fred Hoyle, who's a famous atheist and astrophysicist, saying a super intellect has monkeyed with physics.
Do you have a favoured explanation across those?
I think in terms of what should we do next as a physicist, the answer is that all of those are kind of on the table for me, especially as a Christian physicist. I've written papers trying to test the multiverse. If I had some theory that predicted the mass of the electron in terms of mathematical constants, I would publish it tomorrow and then book a ticket to Stockholm to win my Nobel Prize. Like, heck yes, I'll take that. So I think scientifically they're all open. I think where it's really interesting is rather than trying to say what might the future of science do, saying let's just take stock of where we are and 100 years of being told that science points away from God or a mind or design or whatever. Let's just take stock of where we are, and fine-tuning allows you to sort of do that and say, well, what, it looks designed all the way down to the fundamental deepest equations we know about. In the sense, in the sort of normal sense of something looks designed, if when you rearranged it, it wouldn't do the thing it does. I think that's very interesting, and that's no reason to stop doing science. But at least if you're trying to say, all right, let's take stock of what we've learned about the world, it's a very interesting fact.
Personally, I'm a Christian chaplain. I'm a committed Christian, and when I look at that stuff as a layperson, I just see it as a great big blurry arrow pointing at the possibility, at least, of some creator that sort of set the thing up. It's hard for me to see a different option there. Like I do hear people talking about the multiverse and things, but that seems like if you need to generate more or less infinite other universes in order for this one to work, it's a lot of work.
Yeah, it's almost an acknowledgement of, if I say the best physics we know about, the deepest we've gone, looks for all the world like it's got fingerprints on it, and you say, well, what if there's some physics we don't know about? Like, okay, let's at least take stock of where we are. Like, I don't know what physics is going to do tomorrow. Maybe some evidence the multiverse will turn up. But in the meantime, maybe at least stop saying that science points away from God. Can we at least say that much? Even if you think it's ambiguous, right?
In the popular imagination, science and faith are still seen as irreconcilable. That you can either have a science explanation for everything or a godish one. But you seem to be saying not so irreconcilable.
One of the reasons why maybe it's a bit easier for me is that I do simulations of universes on my computer and on bigger computers. I hit go and a universe is sort of made on my computer and I watch it and I decided how it's going to go and then I watch it play out. There's a joke here about God complexes which you can all fill in yourself. But that sense of why does that thing happen in the simulation? It's because the way the simulation was set up and because I wanted it to go that way. I haven't locked myself out of my own little world in there, and yet there's scientific explanations within the little world that I've created. And that's not a perfect picture of God and the universe, but it's at least good enough to get rid of a number of sort of silly counter arguments where, if science explains something, that leaves no room for God. And if at least you have that simple, slightly oversimplified picture in your head, then you can see how those two, the explanation within the world, the explanation above the world, in that simple sense, sort of fit together.
Have you ever felt in your career, especially when you're a student, that your faith and science was in tension?
So I did, because I was raised in a church that was young earth creationist, which obviously creates a few tensions.
Same here.
Yeah, so was I.
Oh, wow. Yeah, we'll high five later. I'm getting a lot of that this trip. I'm currently in New Zealand over from Australia, talking in a bunch of places, and me too. That's happened an awful lot. So for me, what was very helpful was that I could see that there were different areas where Christianity and the world, for want of a better term, came intellectually into conflict, or at least into dialogue with each other. And I read across a number of these areas, and the philosophers were holding their own, and the historians were holding their own, and the sort of people who saw the evidence for God within the laws of nature as we know them, they were holding their own. But as I went further on with my physics education, I was able to sort of check up on what I'd been told about young earth creationism, and it just fell apart in my hands. So things like, they say there's no good explanation within the Big Bang theory of why galaxies form, and no one's really looking into it, which is literally written in a book I can give you the reference for. I start looking into this field, and I'm like, there are conferences with 1,500 people who are looking into this. I mean, the reply might be, well, if there's that many people, I'm like, but that was the sort of, as soon as I could start looking into these things for myself. And so that's why there wasn't really a crisis of faith, because I could just see how it was holding together pretty well. I mean, there's loads of questions, of course, but I could see what it was for Christianity to hold its own. And so this one bit, where at the same time I'm discovering there are people who don't think that's what Genesis says, who are holding their own. That's why it was just sort of it turns out I didn't understand one of the books of the Bible, which is fine. I still don't understand Revelation, so that's not any great, mystery.
It's interesting that you didn't jettison the whole thing when that's a sense of a pillar of young earth creationism, that wasn't holding up the whole thing.
No, and it's funny because I think it's because, yes, my church was young earth creationist, but this is going to sound odd, not dogmatically so. There was a local science teacher from the local high school, and the pastor, who happened to be Dad, did a talk about his problems with evolution, and then the science teacher got up and started to grill him on a few things, and no one kicked that guy out of church. Right, I mean, his wife was the best pianist in church. Maybe that was it. But, and my piano teacher, wonderful couple. But it was, you can stand up and have and disagree with the pastor about this, and welcome back to church on Sunday. It wasn't that, so there was no ostracism as far as I could tell, and so that helped.
One thing I wonder about, as I understand it, most ancient cosmologies look something like flat Earth, dome of sky supported on pillars, realm of the dead underneath us, and that does seem to be really reflected in the Bible. If their picture of the world is so different to the one that you experience looking through a telescope or simulating a universe, how do you bring those two things together? How do you sort of get meaning or from the text that is so from such an alien worldview?
For me, it's an open question of what's taught by the text versus what's the worldview of the people who wrote it. And so, if you ask Paul, what's the shape of the earth? I don't know if he gets that right or wrong, right? I mean, Aristotle got it right. He might have got it right. But the point is that it's not in the letters anywhere. And so, yes, the people who wrote the Bible had some wrong opinions about the world, as do we. We just don't know what they are yet. And so there's that sense of, at least I can separate those two issues. So it's a question of what's actually taught there. And then there's the question of, I could use an illustration from science, and if the science wrong, if I'm trying to acknowledge, I'm trying to illustrate another fact, then, it's the deeper thing I'm going for. So there's a passage in Ecclesiastes which says something like the winds blow to the north and then to the south and then around to the north again. The idea of everything's going in circles when he's a bit depressed. And all the rivers flow into the sea, but the sea is not full to the place where the rivers start, the waters return, something like that. And obviously, you can't say, if God whispers in his ear, just say, like an electron going around an atom and everything goes backward. Like that. That's no good. No one gets what you're talking about. So it's a question of, do you make the Bible completely opaque to everyone who tries to read it for 2,000 years or more? Or do you sort of use the illustrations that people at the time understand and we can go along with as well when we don't have to buy the the content of the illustration? I find that the things it's trying to teach me, even if they're couched in old examples, are still separable from those, so I don't have to buy the flat cosmology, even assuming that's there. And the hints of it are pretty subtle, to be honest. Like, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's true.
What does the word firmament mean? I don't know. Ask some historian. Sorry, a Hebrew expert.
Can you tell us any more about kind of your faith journey through this whole thing? Has it been a smooth ride?
Perhaps surprisingly, given that I went from young Earth creationism to being a professional cosmologist. But yeah, so I grew up in a small town in New South Wales, Australia, in Maxville.
Even Rayne?
Never heard of it.
No one's heard of Maxville, that's fine. So I grew up within that sort of background, went to, church and Christian school and, youth group and all that sort of stuff. And it was generally very supportive. It was a nice place to grow up. Nice place for everyone to grow up. If Maxfield TAFE ever wants to open up an astronomy department, I'll be there, but that's very unlikely. It's just right near the ocean. It's a really nice place to live. Anyway, so yeah, and then got interested in science almost as a result of being interested in young Earth creationism, which is sort of slightly backfired from their point of view, I suppose. and so, as well as being good at maths and all that sort of stuff. But as a part of that, sort of read everything I could in uni, realised that I needed to sort of know this stuff. One of the things that really helped, which is obviously not something you can plan, but I was like, okay, well, let's read something by an atheist. And these days, back in the old days, you actually went into a bookshop. And there was a book there called The Ways of an Atheist. And it was terrible. It was one of the worst books I've ever read. Just one non sequitur after another. And it was just sort of, it just calms you down a bit. Like, okay, they're not all geniuses over there. If that helps. I think it helped that my high school was sort of small enough. It was the Christian high school, but there was 44 people in my year. It was small enough that you couldn't really split up on that many lines. It's not like the Christians and the non-Christians would form a separate group of friends and all that stuff. Like, you're all in together, so whatever you think we can hang out helps. And they're not all geniuses. They might have some good ideas, but we've got to find the smart ones and really think about what they think. And these sorts of things just sort of slowed down there was no urgency in desperately trying to work out whether everything I'd ever been taught was right or not. I could sort of go through things one at a time. So, yeah.
What is your, sort of wondering about your spiritual life these days? Like, what job does God do in your framing of the world, or what is spirituality to you?
My spirituality is a very, very good question. I find a lot of value just still in the most, going to church, and that's still something that the songs get you every week, and I find a lot of value in that. I find a lot of value in the community there. I'm at a church in Sydney, and of late I've started helping out in the youth group. Basically because my daughter's now 14, but I started helping in the youth group before she arrived in the youth group, so it doesn't look like I'm spying on her. But yes. But I found that really valuable, that there's sort of, in a way, less of a filter. But at the same time, I can see kids who they have these questions and they're just, not all of them, but they're happy that there's someone here at church who's just, bring it, whatever you've got. And maybe I don't know, but let's go find someone who does know. And whatever question you've got, someone's probably answered 1,500 years ago or something like that. If you can ask a genuinely unique question of Christianity, well done, because most of them, someone's done a PhD on this somewhere. And we can go and find that person and we can see whether we like what they answered and what did they say. And just connecting them in their little world out in the southwest of Sydney with the whole stream of Christianity, I find that very rewarding. So that's been great over the last couple of years. And it's that's a specific bit of community, but that's, for me, a very important bit.
What's it like working, I assume, in a secular university as a Christian? And it sounds like a lot of your research and your faith is quite intertwined, from what I understand.
Sort of intertwined. I mean, I wrote the book on this A Fortunate Universe with Geraint Lewis, who's an atheist. So it's certainly, the papers I publish mostly just go straight into astrophysical journals, because this is a question, what happens if I change that number? And so there's a lot of that. I've written a couple of, my amateur attempts at philosophy, but, in philosophy journals. It helps that there's a couple of things about Western Sydney that kind of help. One of them is the physics department's quite small, and amongst the astrophysicists there's sort of 4 of us, and one of the other guys is a Christian, so that helps. We're not going to be outvoted or anything. I generally find it quite supportive. One of the things we're very cognizant of out in Western Sydney is that there are enormous immigrant communities, and the whole village in Nepal has saved up to send their smartest kid to us to get him that education that they want. Yeah, man, we'll move heaven and earth. It is genuinely not just racially diverse, but we've got to include the beliefs of all the people who turn up with us in a sort of, let's make everyone feel like, yes, you can do well here without us pushing you into a mould. And so I find it quite good. There's not a real cutthroat atmosphere. It's funny, when I got to Cambridge to do my PhD, a lot of the PhD students who had come from America had commented that in their institutions that things were a bit more, you felt you were competing with the other students. But that wasn't the case at Cambridge, and I've certainly not in Sydney University or Western Sydney. I think that's very good. So yeah, it's been a good place to work.
I don't know what the feeling might be like here on that front of Vic.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the economic pressures make it a bit more cutthroat, in my opinion.
And maybe from hearing from students, possibly in the humanities more, that it's not so easy to be Christian visibly on campus.
Yeah, I think conversations around colonialism always bring up a lot of questions about Christianity for young people. Yeah.
It's interesting from your description, Luke, of your past and current Christian faith and community and stuff. It sounds very appealing. And but I'm imagining that Australia is like New Zealand, and Christian identification is just sort of tanking.
Yes. I'm not sure how fast tanking implies, but
here it's 1% a year, down 1% a year.
Oh, okay. I don't know what the rate is.
Sorry, we're sitting at about 61% at the moment in Australia of people who identify as Christians.
Okay.
It's quite high. Higher than New Zealand.
I don't know what to do with that. To be honest, part of that is actually, I don't know. There's parts of Sydney where so my brother is also a Christian minister, and there was an open spot in the old church in the eastern suburbs of the upper class suburbs of Sydney, and the comment was, that's just you're going to go there, there's going to be a bunch of old people who are just sitting in the pews until they get a chance to put their coffin in the cemetery out the back. That's why they're in the pews. But at the same time, I'm out west, and there's growing communities, there's young families, and we're filling a 400-seat auditorium every Sunday, 1.5 times. It's strange how the demographics are changing. I can't predict the future, obviously, and I'm not sure what happens next. But it's funny to me how much my generation feels like if people are non-Christian from about my age, I'm 40, chances are their parents at least went to Sunday school or something. Whereas my generation and younger, there's that feeling of the same sense of, I know all about Christianity, but actually no one's been in a church. No one knows firsthand what those people believe. They think they know what those people believe. Be interesting if that backfires on itself. Like, that sort of, they actually believe something way different to what I thought. So I'm not sure what happens in the next few years, but we're sort of on that same downward general trend.
In our country, I don't think there are that many sort of gifted spokespeople making a compelling and appealing case for why you might want to explore this as a life option.
Yeah, and there's those assumptions about what you were saying in terms of science, that religion is irrational, inherently irrational, and doesn't make any sense, which is something that I find quite interesting.
You mentioned you have been publishing, I think maybe you said in a hobby sort of way, in philosophy.
Yes.
What kinds of things have you talked about there?
Basically, my attempt to make the fine-tuning argument for the existence of God as watertight as I can make it. So I can see various ways that people are trying to do it. So this is that sort of analytic philosophy of religion, to properly just lay out the steps in a logical order of how you're going to do it. Having just talked to a whole bunch of audiences and heard just every objection under the sun, I just think there's ways of doing it which just knock those objections out before they get started, and you can get down to the interesting core of the argument. And what I think is particularly interesting is how much of the shape of that argument I can sort of pull straight out of science. Not the whole thing, because the conclusion is supposed to be God, so there's got to be something else in there. It's a philosophical argument, but I can get an awful lot of the method and the premises out of science, which is very interesting to me. So I've attempted to do that and just sort of answer a few objections that have turned up on technical issues about probabilities and these sorts of things. But there's a couple of sort of ways of actually putting it together. I got an email out of the blue by two rabbis. This sounds like the start of a joke, and who said, we're putting together a podcast and sort of writing a book on fine-tuning. Can you have a read? Can you have a look? And I saw, the way they did it. I went, that's another way of doing it. That's interesting. And, I nearly wrote them a long email. And I thought, let's have a Zoom and a chat and let's see what, I've tried this in front of an audience. What have you tried? And, interesting things.
What kind of objections come out at the popular level?
So last time I tried to put together a set of slides with all the objections, I had 31.
Yeah.
In the book, it's the same as the number of constants. In the book, we do 16. So chapter 7 of the book is just 16 different responses. So some of them are very basic, like, maybe it's just a coincidence. And to which you say, we might conclude that, but let's go looking around at the other options first. Things like, there's only one universe. We know this one has life in it, so your probabilities are 1 out of 1, which is not how you use probabilities in physics. You don't just go, there's the data, so the probability of that data is 1, so my theory is correct. No, that's not how that works. Things like evolution explains all of this. And the answer is no, we're looking at the preconditions for evolution to happen. The universe has got to do stuff before evolution can get started. It's basically the question of what does the universe have to do before evolution can take over and do anything. Objections around why, if this universe is fine-tuned, why is so much of it hostile to life and empty of life?
That's a good one.
Yeah, I haven't heard that one.
That's not bad. And the problem with that one is, what are you comparing? You're comparing this universe with one that's more full of life. And the contention is, if you don't get these numbers right, almost all of them are more empty of life. So if you can see why wouldn't be any life in just empty space out there, well, it's really easy to make a universe which is all that and none of this. Yeah, that's a question we could ask, but you're missing the main story here of what are, amongst a set of possibilities, what does most of them look like? If most universes were like packed with life and we're in this really sparse universe with empty space everywhere, like what's going on? Not the case. We're in the interesting one that does fascinating stuff, and most of them are just complete non-starters. I was actually at a philosophy summer school in the middle of last year, 2023, and one of the ones they wanted to talk about in particular was, it seems to complete the argument, you've got to give some sort of reason why God would want to make a life-permitting universe. Because if you have no idea what God wants, then in just any old universe, you might expect if there's no God in just any old universe, there is God, and so there's no help there. If I deal a deck of poker hands and I get 5 royal flushes in a row whenever I deal, you've got to add to that, and he would want that because a royal flush wins automatically any hand of poker and he wins money, right? So you've just got to add, that's got to be somewhere in there. So how much theology do you really want to start doing in these bits? Like I said, I can get a lot of the argument out of science, but I can't get that bit. And so one of the other philosophers there who's not a Christian but is sort of sympathetic to this argument in some sort of way. All right, who's going to step up to the plate and give us some reasons why a God would want a life-permitting universe? And there's things to say there. Richard Swinburne's said things like this in The Existence of God, his book. But that's a part of it. You can't just sort of sweep that under the rug and say, hey, I'm just doing science.
I recently came across a paper by Jeffrey Shainline called, I can't remember what it's called, but it's about fine-tuning of the universe for technology, not just life. And it was noticing the properties of things like silicon and germanium that are so amenable to digital technology, in particular various other characteristics of physics that mean the kind of technology that is in no way necessary for life, but is totally necessary for advanced civilization are in there. Have you sort of considered that stuff at all?
So there's another philosopher who used to be a physicist in the US, Robin Collins. He calls it fine-tuning for discoverability. There's various ways in which the universe is easier to discover or promotes discoverability in ways beyond just being life-permitting. An interesting one from the early universe is, so super hot just after the Big Bang, and you can sit down and do a calculation of, okay, if it's really hot, the nuclear reactions are going to happen. I've got the stuff there. The first thing you make, protons and neutrons. How much of the next most abundant thing you're going to make, where you put them together into helium, the second thing on the periodic table? And you do the calculation, and out comes the answer of about 25%. And then you go look at the actual universe, it's about 25% helium. And you're like, hey, that was great. But if you change the numbers, you can change it so the universe burns all to helium, and that's probably life, if not prohibiting, at least, it's not great. Stars burn out quicker. You need helium for water, H2O. There's various ways you wouldn't want that. On the other way, a hydrogen-only universe, that's not that bad. That's pretty good. You still make stars, you still make water. But what you don't have is that discoverability of, am I right about the early universe? How much helium would I expect? Basically none. Oh, I see basically none, but that's not really a great prediction, right? I mean, there could be none for a bunch of other reasons. And so there's a way in which, here's the range of possibilities, here's all the ones where don't go there, that's probably not good for life. But amongst what the sort of open possibilities, here's where some interesting discoverability is, and that's kind of where we are. It's quite hard, and he's got himself in a bit of a tangle about there's ways the universe could be more discoverable, and then you try to sort of say, okay, but if it was too easy to discover, it'd just be all, it's like a puzzle, right? You don't want it to be too easy or too hard, it's got to be in the middle. But how do you quantify that? And so he's got himself in this, what I think is a bit of a tangle. Either he's in a tangle or he's just not explaining it very well, of meta-discoverability, that we discover that it's discoverable. And I'm a bit worried about that. There's an analogy that kind of works here of, this is my analogy, not his, but suppose we had a robot company that makes sort of realistic human-looking robots, and we're trying to prove that ours is the best. And we say, look, I can optimize the most athletic robot. And someone says, well, I mean, what do you mean athletic? There's loads of ways you could be the most athletic. And you could try and justify one set of criteria if you wanted. Or you could say, well, Usain Bolt, he's one of ours, right? And that would work. If there's just some criteria where you're really obviously winning, that would sort of be good evidence. So I think he's going along those lines, but he's been writing a book on this for like a decade and a half, so I don't know what's going on. But yeah, there's these interesting little hints. I tend to just go straight on, are you going to make a life-permitting universe, because it's kind of easier. But yeah, there are hints along those lines.
Might be a stupid question, but like when you're writing a paper for a philosophy journal, what are you ultimately trying to achieve? Like, you want it to be published, but you put those arguments out there. What do you hope might happen as a result?
Part of it is I've been defending this argument in sort of popular level forums and just having it, all right, if you want all the footnotes and technical details, like you have to leave so much stuff out when you talk live, even to a room of philosophers, even to a room of physicists, and just having all the footnotes somewhere, just having the, all right, here's how I think it should be done. That was basically it. Like, I think I can see a way of presenting this argument that is similar to what other people have done, and it's just going to, line everything out for me. It's got so much intuitive appeal that it's not, I don't expect the technical paper to be the main version of it that goes around, but some people really want to check that you're crossing every T and dotting every I.
So it's about sort of robustness and trust that you are and feel authorised to kind of make the popular level stuff because you know that you've done all the work.
Yeah, there's a bit of that. And I sort of, someone asks a question, you give an answer, and you're just sort of flying by the seat of your pants. And actually, hang on, let's just take a second to really nail down what my response to that particular objection. So the paper is called A Reasonable Little Question, the one I'm talking about. And there's some objections there that I can sort of go through slowly rather than just sort of trying to shoot from the hip.
It's very appealing, that disciplined attention to the sort of the life of the mind, or the getting the arguments right, and not just shooting from the hip. Yeah, I got invited a couple of years ago there's an organisation, a philanthropic organisation in the US, who wanted to move specifically into funding science and religion projects, and so just got a bunch of people from, I don't know how I ended up there, but sure. And there's another person attending who was an analytic philosopher, and they'd given us this thing to read, which was going to be their vision for what they wanted to do. And the analytic philosopher said, oh yeah, I know what's going on here. You know the science, but you want to say something broader about spirituality. And so you write something down, and then you look at it and you think, that's what a hippie would say. And then you're like, you got to try again. And we were there to try again. Like, okay, someone please tell me this in a way that was his comment, and I thought that's pretty spot on. But that sort of, okay, help, I need a philosopher, I get that from time to time.
When you were talking about theology, I was just wondering, you get to a theological conclusion by the end of your string of research. And I had a question about interreligious dialogue and theology.
Sure.
How different religions have made sense of the universe and our place in it. You've talked about how we need a creator with a purpose, and some religions don't have a creator with a purpose, and I was just wondering how the dialogue between different theologies would work, or do you mostly focus on the Christian theologies?
So I've mostly focused on the Christian ones, but occasionally I get the question of, okay, even if I believed you, why shouldn't I become a Muslim? And the answer is on other criteria. And I can't. Yeah. We're doing physics here, man. When you look through a telescope and work out what religion is for you. But so interestingly, because this question came up recently of, okay, do your theology, right? What do you think God would want to do? I actually have a student who, having done an astrophysics master's in the UK but being from Pakistan, wanted to come and do a PhD with me about all of this stuff on the science level, but he's a very committed Muslim. And so I've had a couple of chats with him about this particular premise. If you were asked that question, what would you say? And his answer was broadly along the lines of, this universe is a test. God would make a universe like this in order to sort of, I guess, produce the right sort of people, something like that. And I thought there might be a paper in this at some point. I don't know if it helps his career or mine, to be honest, but I'm sure there's certain journals that would jump at it. Here's two physicists, one a Christian, one a Muslim, trying to think through what this means for the way that their theology shines a light on this. Again, talked to a couple of rabbis about this argument, and generally there's not much difference there. That's interesting. And broader than that, I'm not sure. I'd love to know. I guess it would depend on your picture of creation, picture of God's attributes, picture of God at all, I suppose. Yeah, that's interesting. So I've only gone sort of as far as the other Abrahamic faiths, but trying to venture out a little bit.
Yeah.
Also on theology, from my reading, the Bible paints a picture of a very tight link between human destiny and human past and sort of cosmic destiny and past.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of like, St. Paul talking about the creation being subject to decay and sort of anxiously longing for the revealing of the children of God, which I love, but I wonder, how do you marry that with like, contemplating the whole cosmos and how could stuff that's happening on planet Earth and humans failing or succeeding in their responsibilities, how could that have anything to do with the cosmic picture?
Yeah, so this is one of those arguments there's a lot of arguments from the young Earth creationist days which have sort of fallen by the wayside, but this is an interesting one I'm not quite sure what to do with, to be perfectly honest. So there's the Paul's picture of the fall of being quite a cosmic thing, but it's only it's a verse or two. So, how much do I want to put on that? So I've heard people say, theologians of a more conservative sort of background, say things like, that's going to affect all the laws of nature, and it's affected everything in the universe, and this always turns back into an argument against uniformitarianism, so you don't trust science and blah blah blah. I know where it's going, but what how to interpret that bit of Paul is a very interesting question, or what to think about. What is Genesis trying to tell us, even if it's I don't think it is giving us a timescale for something. In the end, the creation being subject to frustration. There's a sense in which certainly things are winding down, the second law of thermodynamics and all of that, but that's not something that could have happened after, if there's some point in time when you want to say this is when people had moral responsibility and sinned, right? The second law can't start then, right? It's a much more general thing. And so what does subject to frustration mean? You could interpret it in a sort of, and I'm thinking of C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy here, which I read again over the summer. Even if it's just this one planet, there's some part of creation which is out of order, and if some bit of it's out of order, it's not like Andromeda's fine, right? There's some bit of it that's out of order, and so until it's a whole, it's not a whole. So maybe those lines, but yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. That I'm an astrophysicist, so none of my training is relevant here. But yeah, these are the sorts of things to wrestle with.
I think that we live in the age of decay presently. Like, even very good lives have all sorts of tragedy and trouble in them, and there's not enough justice to go around. And how do you see eschatology? Like, do you see the creation renovated in some way, or the earth sorted out?
I see this. I got to ask this question, and it sort of stops the Christians in the room, and which is why I like to give the answer. So, according to cosmology, what's the future of the universe? In 5 billion years, the sun runs out of fuel, and as it tries to spark up again, it expands and goes past the orbit of the Earth. So, whatever's left then goes inside the sun, which is not as fun as it sounds. Maybe exactly as bad as it sounds. Slowly this fate overcomes all of the stars, the bigger ones first, the smaller ones later. They all start to die out. The acceleration of space will eventually draw a line around us, and anything not bound to the Milky Way will be sort of lost forever. We won't even be able to see it. And so you just draw out this pretty depressing picture of, in the science that follows. I think the hope is precisely that we've seen an example of, if the resurrection means anything, it means that there are some things here that have a temporary purpose. So one of the problems that physicists that I've read, especially who aren't Christians, have with this whole picture is like why would God make a law of nature and then to break it? How could you believe in miracles? Well, if there's something here that's got a temporary purpose that will be broken, that's a reason, not just some random, just for a bit of fun one afternoon. So if the resurrection means anything, that means that death is that. It's the sort of thing that's going to be done away with. It'll serve its purpose and then it'll be finished. And that, I think, is the reason for thinking that this, whatever the future is of the universe, that if there's a mind behind it, then these laws are just the way he's running it right now. The way that God is just, there's an order, there's a way of doing it. It's amazing. but it's in the end just the purpose of what God has made thus far. The question of how can you believe in God if that's that fate of running down is the future of the universe? Well, it's precisely I believe in God. I believe that's not necessarily the future of the universe. And the time scale does that is up to God, but yeah.
I think that leads us very nicely to our standard question. As I've already said to you personally, this podcast is about how to draw out hope within academia.
Yeah.
And so our main question, the podcast, is where do you find your hope in light of your life and work and evidently your theology as well?
One of the things that draws me in about Christianity is that the sort of things that you love have eternal significance. That a statement like, hey, that sunset's beautiful, is true. It's not just the way that this lump in my head has reacted to some photons or something. And so various statements like that, like love is the most important thing in reality, and there's hope for the future, and it matters that I love my kids. They're true statements. They're not just something I can choose to believe if I want to try and give my life some purpose. And so I find that it's not that there's that I don't find any hope in the universe and therefore I have to go looking somewhere else. Like the whole picture of if there's a God, then there's an order of the way things work around here, and we get some of it, which is science, and we don't get some of it, which is why I still have a job and get to do more science. And so I find the hope in both the order I see pointing to a creator, but then the creator being above that order, meaning that things that are bad really are bad here and now, but they could be part, and are part, I think, obviously, of a bigger plan. Yeah.
It sounds like you're very closely tying hope and meaning, that sense that there are a lot of stories out there that want to say it's all illusory in various ways, that it's just chemicals in your brain or whatever.
Yeah.
You're saying that this really matters. This is the real thing.
Yeah, I had the opportunity of listening the other night to Zachary Arden, who's talking here tomorrow night after I talk tonight. And he just, as part of his talk, another Christian in science, but an evolutionary biologist, 2 quotes basically from atheists who are scientists. One basically saying, you're small in the cosmos, so be as loving to other people as you can. And the other one saying, you're small in the cosmos, so who cares how you treat other people? And I just, the way the universe is, there's not enough within physics to pin on a statement like that's beautiful, that's good, that's loving, that's love is important. There's just not enough there. That's just the way the universe is. There's more to pin those truths on.
Another standard Happy Revolution question is what books are you reading, or what books have been super important to you?
So I'm currently reading The Penultimate Curiosity by Andrew Briggs and Roger Wagner. Briggs is a material scientist and a physicist at Oxford, who I had the pleasure of meeting last year, and Wagner, I believe, is some sort of artist. Briggs is a Christian, and the penultimate curiosity is, if you have the ultimate curiosity about God and how everything's come together, it's sort of naturally falls in after that to want to know, okay, what's the next thing down, which is the way nature works at that level, and just tracing that throughout history. So it's basically a history of science, but going back quite early into sort of early anthropology, which is not something I've looked at, but really interesting. So yeah, that's the current thing. It's various. Every time I read something about Galileo, it's just amazing. That whole story is so bananas. Just, he was the Pope's friend. And things like that, where, it's not like it's a spat between two people who know each other. Like, basically, it would have been a workplace kerfuffle, except that one of them was the Pope and the other one forgot that the other one was the Pope. Like, what are you doing, man? Yeah, so history of science, I think, is all crucial. So that's a really nice, really good introduction to that. I'm enjoying that at the moment.
This is real off topic, but have you ever read The Atheist Delusions by David Bentley Hart?
Yes, I have. Hang on to that one, or I've read David Bentley Hart.
Love David Bentley Hart, but he has an interesting take on the Galileo story, which is not relevant.
Maybe I haven't read it. I've read some of his. I've definitely read his one on God,
I really enjoyed that book.
What's it called?
Being Consciousness Bliss.
That's the one.
The Experience of God.
He's one of those where the scholarship is good and the snark is just so great.
He's brilliant. In Atheist Delusions, he goes after the big atheists, and it is hilarious.
Okay.
So funny.
He doesn't seem like a nice man.
There's a bit of that, isn't there? Yeah.
What about books for you that have been really important to you in your thinking?
Formational.
I've already mentioned I've read everything by C.S. Lewis. I read the Narnia Chronicles again over the break, as well as the Space Trilogy, and read the Screwtape Letters again. Why did I leave those for so long? They're so brilliant. And there's an audio book with all of his essays, and it's like 38 hours long. I've read that. That was amazing. So he's a constant sort of touchstone.
What do you get from him?
A couple of things. One of them is, and I use this analogy actually trying to explain it to the youth group of why I'm constantly quoting C.S. Lewis. There's a feeling of, if you're a tennis fan and you see Roger Federer hit a forehand, you think, oh, that's how that's supposed to happen. Like everyone else who hit a forehand was trying to do that. When C.S. Lewis puts words in a certain order, you're like, oh, that's how that's supposed to happen. That's the order of those words. And there's just such a basic joy of reading someone who writes that well. And beyond that, I find, because he's not any sort of official theologian, he feels a bit more free to go with a flight of fancy. I mean, this is kind of the whole point of the Space Trilogy. Like, what if Mars hadn't fallen? What if someone turned up right in the middle of Venus's Garden of Eden? I mean, that's an interesting thing to think about. I find everything expressed just deliciously and wonderfully, and I find the sorts of ideas that should be, bigger everywhere else, just expressed so particularly well with him. So yeah,
I think that his book Till We Have Faces is one of the most interesting, complex books ever written. It's one of my favourite books. So good.
I'll go through that one again.
It was his favourite, I think, but I read it once and didn't ever go back.
Yeah. It's very complex. I'm sure you can understand.
Agreed. Yeah. Yeah. I every time someone asks me what's your favourite, I give a different answer every time. It was Miracles for a long time.
Are you seeing anyone in contemporary life who's doing that kind of public theology role well?
There's a few voices out there that I think are doing reasonably well. Lewis is such a unique voice, though. I think Alistair McGrath is doing his best. Yeah, there's no other C.S. Lewis. It's just that simple. Yeah. Certainly who's sort of captured everyone on every side, I don't think so. There's fans of David Bentley Hart. There's fans of, within Catholic circles, Ed Fazer's another one with philosophical background, good, solid philosophical cases, and just very good snark when he wants to snark as well. In the evangelical circles, it was Tim Keller, who passed away recently, but there's another voice there. I don't think there's any sort of one big voice, which is a bit of a shame, but
I don't know if the Tim Kellers of the world, do they reach beyond the borders of the church to create new audiences?
That's a good question. It's a very good question. Lewis had the great advantage, of course, of that Narnia went. It was a blockbuster, basically. It's one of the biggest selling books of the 20th century or something. And so to have someone write the sort of book that sells 100 million copies and then write apologetics is just, good luck. When are we going to see that again? It'd be nice for, maybe I'll just write a kid's book and it'll sell 100 million copies and then everyone will buy a Fortune of the Universe. Like, that's not going to happen.
Is there anything we should have asked you but didn't?
Actually, I find the more I think about it, the more I don't see what the problem with the clockmaker is.
Oh, yeah? This is
No, so part of that is I know what it's like to set up a simulation of the universe and have it go exactly the way I wanted from the start. And
is that what's happened? I don't know.
And I don't know what. Yeah, exactly. I can't see any difference between saying just the fact that the universe runs according to certain rules. To jump from that to therefore he just set it up and then let it go and now doesn't care does not in any way follow. It just doesn't. Especially if you have a picture of And again, this is where it matters whether you're a Thomist or something else, or what sort of thing you are. If you're a Thomist, which I'm not because I don't understand it, but I'm trying to, they'd have a picture of the laws of nature just are how God runs the universe. And so, if I walk up to a chalkboard every day and draw a perfect circle, at no point does the perfection of that circle and the regularity of me drawing it mean that the circle could draw itself. They're just completely different questions to me. So this jump from, is the universe more like an organism? Is it more like a clock? Is it more like it's probably like none of those things. But then at no point is there a question of, is there a God behind it? Oh no, he's locked himself out of his universe again and forgotten the keys. I think it's just a bizarre thing to think.
I think the question is, beyond that, how is God involved and how often and to what level? And how much do we as humans have autonomy?
There's a couple of things there. One, again, because I run my own universe, right? Everyone should try this. Maybe we should just run a computer program. There's a sense in which, I forget who, I heard this quote from somewhere, I should look up the original, that design by wholesale is more impressive than design by retail, is the way someone put it. As in, God can make his universe according to the same laws that run the universe and do what he wants there without having to stick his finger in, in sort of retail, anything that he particularly wants. How much does God need to do something which wouldn't have otherwise happened? And I think from my point of view, as a physicist, I still feel that. Why would God do a miracle? And I think there are reasons. I think there are things around here that are temporary. But beyond that, this is part of the problem I have with this. There's a sort of intelligent design. And obviously I'm a fan of the broad sense of, I see design behind the universe. But a lot of the advocates of that view seem to have this, let's find where it looks like something happened really fast, and that must be where God stuck God's finger in. Or, the history of life on this planet is God gets something started, it sort of evolves a bit, it sort of peters out a bit, gets it another kick, and then, trilobites, and then off we go. And that's a weird picture of the way you think the universe works.
There were deficiencies in the original that needed sort of occasional...
Yeah, why wouldn't God just get it right in the first place? It's us who's drawing the wrong conclusion that if God just got it right in the right place and the history of life just rolled out, that would therefore mean that God didn't need to do anything, or that there's no mind behind it. And so actually it's we who need the miracles, to the extent that I believe that. And even then, there's this interesting book that I don't know what to do with, by a guy called Colin Humphreys, who looks at the miracles in Exodus. And one of the things is, if you have in mind the picture of them crossing the Jordan, if you just imagine that in your head, like they get to the Jordan and then the Jordan stops and then over they go, you might have a picture of there they are and then the water's just like stopped there. But it's not what it says. It says it stops some distance away in a place called Damia or Adama. And he says, okay, that's a weird detail. And then he finds that there's a place somewhere around there, and the name has the same consonants but not the same vowels, so maybe. And once a century, an earthquake will cause a landslide that stops the Jordan for a few days. Now, I don't know whether any of that is in fact true. I've not done the research. But that for me, there's something very pleasing about that picture of God. Of the Israelites walking towards the Jordan and God going, watch this, and then the earth. And he doesn't stick his finger in, just the tectonic plates move, the right bit of magma boils up, that bit rumbles, the water stops. And just as they get there, the water stops, and over they go. That, for me, that design by wholesale of getting it right from day one, it's 13.8 billion years out. Watch this. Nailed it. Right? That's a very pleasing picture to me. Now, I don't know what to do with that very pleasing picture, but that's the sort of picture I have of seeing God running a universe, intervene if you must for the important purpose of pointing out some bit that will change, but otherwise get it right the first time.
I don't think we have time, but doesn't that beg the question of how can God use, or how is some of the literal elements of the earth work for God's purposes, while others, it results in tsunamis that decimate cities?
Yeah.
I find that really confronting and quite, upsetting, to be honest.
Yeah, so I think, the hard bullet to try and bite there is something along the lines of that God has a plan for the evil and suffering. And again, if it's written in from the start of time, that's even harder to swallow, maybe. But, either God knew it was coming or made it happen live, and I don't think either of those sort of get God off the hook. There's a very strange book I read that basically saying evolution is the answer to the problem of evil because it sort of gets God off the hook. But, no, what's your tiny picture of God there? They're the trilobites are at it again.
Even for me, the Holocaust is a very hackneyed example in some ways, but the thought of a God who creates that possibility, a universe where humans can get as terribly evil as that.
Yeah,
it's quite a scary. It's a very scary thought.
Yeah, I think at the very least for me, the physics of it doesn't make the problem worse. The problem's bad enough as it is. Not that everything's fine now, but either God creates a tsunami live in the moment by sticking his finger in, or he's ordained it since the beginning of the universe. And either way, I feel like someone had this theory about the book of Job. Why does God say at the end, Job has spoken rightly of me? When he says to the friends, they have not spoken rightly of me. Because if you read it, Job goes off his nut at God. And that's got to be the point of the book. It's not like, I saw a meme on my Facebook yesterday, which was like, in the good times, Job praised God. In the bad times, Job praised God. And then he went off his nut for 20 chapters. Read the rest of the book. There's like 2 verses of, I'll praise God, whatever the circumstance, and 20 chapters of just, I wish I was dead.
Yeah.
I wish you'd never made me. What are you doing? And so why does God get to the end of that and say, Job has spoken rightly about me? And one of the theories, and it sort of works for me, is that Job talks to God and the friends talk to Job. And that's interesting. Because there's that picture of kicking heaven's door down and demanding answers. And has some degree of scriptural support that the pious, I'll just accept this and not ask questions, is 2 verses. And the what are you doing is 20 chapters. Yeah, but I've got no particular insights on this. I'm no theologian, but that's the way I try and put it together.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Job came to mind for me as well, just that the fact that Job says he's seen God when God shows that Leviathan, dragon, fire-breathing creature, that chaotic force is as much an expression of God as the nice things, which is a very scary
that's
thought.
interesting, yeah.
On that dark and ambiguous note.
Yeah. This conversation has been well out of my depth, but thank you so much. It's been really fun.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.